where the government is investing in R&D to dim the sun. So we are simultaneously paying for rooftop solar and less sunlight. The benefit to emissions of having solar panels on roofs is negligible.
England is full. There's no space to build anything. Now, that's not true. We know that's not true.
At the moment is an echo of Sarah Palin's challenge to Barack Obama's supporters back in the day, where she opined, how's that hopey, changey thing going for you? And I think that's very much the case with the Trump supporters now.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here. Today I'm joined by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Energy Analyst, Andy Mayer. Plenty to get our teeth into this week, but before we do follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk to get all of our content, podcasts, briefings, blogs, publications, event invitations straight into your inbox. Now, Andy, you're joining us today. You have your own series on our podcast called Free the Power, where you talk about and deep dive into energy issues with some external energy experts. But today we've hauled you onto our weekly podcast to chat all things energy, because it's been a pretty big week, starting with some blackouts in the Iberian Peninsula. Can you just talk us through what's going on?
So according to the Spanish government, the inquiry is still open, but according to Twitter and people who know something about energy, it's really decided. So there are two separate things to think about in respect of the Iberian blackout. First is trigger events, which is something that all grids have to deal with. And that could be something like lightning hitting a substation and causing a fire, which actually happened in London this week. Another way that can happen is a particular generating station goes offline and destabilizes the grid in some way. Now, all grids are designed to deal with those kind of events. But what's happened in Spain that's really interesting is there has been increased systemic risk. And what this means is each incremental additional risk added to the grid adds to the likelihood of grid failure, which what eventually happened in 5 seconds in Spain. So first, we believe, one solar farm went offline, then another, and that created a cascade of unbalanced frequency on the grid that led various relays, for safety reasons, to trip, shutting down the entire system until it got to the French border, where the entire peninsula was isolated to protect the European grid. Now, just to explain a little bit about why that happens, if you put energy through machines at the wrong frequency, it damages the machines. And that's true whether it's too much frequency or too little. And that's why the relays exist. And the reason things like solar and wind increase the risk of that event happening is because they use direct current, not alternating current, which comes from turbines spinning around in things like gas turbines, nuclear power station turbines, etc., etc. So what happened is the Spanish have been very successful with renewable energy. About 60% of their grid was coming from solar power that day. And that systemic event then got tripped, unintentionally, obviously, and it took time to deal with. But the Spanish were warned, particularly by their own grid operator back in February, that this was an increasing likelihood. And now it's happened. The hope must be that people take far more seriously the idea that you need to be very cautious about adding renewable power to the grid to ensure that it doesn't happen elsewhere.
So the problem is too much energy rather than...
It can be.
Mm. So what does that? What sort of policy implications does that have then? Which is what we're interested in here, of course. What should the UK and more broadly be taken away from this in terms of how to deal with and how to include and boost renewable energy in our grid and energies?
Well, you just highlighted the first policy problem there. The government and various European governments think it's their job to increase the share of renewable energy on the grid. It isn't. Government policy priorities in energy, there are basically three. The first and most important is security of supply, and a blackout is the opposite. So that's insecurity. The second is affordability. If things are not cheap enough for people to be able to afford to use them, then you have effectively people isolated from the energy system. You have industries going abroad. The third priority is decarbonisation. We do want to move to a world where the energy system is not polluting. But the record of renewables on that is patchy. And the thing that needs to change fundamentally is the priority order. So if we had a system that was designed to incentivize secure supply, it would not ban renewables, but it would say if you're going to bring this much capacity of renewables onto the grid, you must have offsetting services there. And there are things that can make solar farms and wind farms behave a little bit more like conventional power. So you have flywheels that generate inertia by turning around at high speed. You can have grid inverters that make a shorter time, give a longer time period for incidents like this to be dealt with. You can have types of batteries that give a short burst of power to offset the damage caused by a system coming offline very quickly. And so it goes on. But these things are expensive and they do impact affordability. So security first, then affordability, then decarbonisation. You would have a much slower low carbon transition, but it would still be happening.
So what should Ed Miliband be taking away from what's happened this week in Spain and Portugal?
Well, I think the expression Ed needs to understand is that governments that lose power lose power.
Nice.
Blackouts, as Edward Heath found in the 1970s, are fatal to your ability to govern and eventually your electoral success. That's not a universal truth, and it's not our business to decide the outcome of future elections. But if you lose that security, particularly in winter, where the consequences of losing power and then losing your heat network are fatal. The big killer across Europe and in fact the world is cold, not heat. And it doesn't have to be particularly cold to increase the number of vulnerable people exposed to a potentially fatal incident. So if I were the government, I would be looking at that Spanish incident and not trying to deny that renewables were the problem. Clearly they were part of the problem, if not the whole thing. I would be looking and saying, how exposed are we to that risk? And is our energy system incentivizing the right things? And if not, we need to change.
Mm-hmm. And as it stands, we're still going for a carbon-free and heavily renewable grid by 2030, which is pretty much around the corner, right? Mm-hmm. We're obviously not going to get there, but we are building in more of these systemic risks, year by year as we go by. I think you put that all brilliantly, Andy, and I can't really compete with your level of analysis and explanation there. So it's another question from me. If people who follow this topic closely, and people who write about it on social media and stuff, I've seen them suggest that we've come close to these blackout incidents in the UK several times in recent years because of the fragility built in by the high share of renewables in the system. Do you kind of agree with that assessment? Have you seen near misses in the recent past? And I won't ask you to gaze into the crystal ball, but how actively worried should we be about something similar happening in the UK?
Well, I've actually been in a blackout incident on the Isle of Lewis in my previous job, where I went out to help a plant that was in the chemical sector, which is energy intensive, and they relied on the Isle of Lewis grid connection to the Scottish mainland in order to keep the product turning around. And the lights went out for about 6 hours. And that's not so uncommon in the islands because they are highly exposed to a heavy concentration of renewable power, in that case, wind. It's quite scary. Dark is properly dark in Scottish Islands, and you can do very little about it. On the more systemic question, NESO, who are the energy security regulator effectively, published a 20-page report in May of 2024 looking at their preparedness for these kind of risks. And I would say we're better off than Spain, and they are a reasonably competent organisation that know what they're doing. But the risk increasing is going to get to a point where it's beyond their control. They cannot predict every eventuality. And if you replace a small number of very large generators with a large number of distributed generators, probably in the wrong place because of our incentive scheme, then that risk is going to get out of their control at some point.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add there is that we really need to get a more sophisticated understanding of how much different forms of energy cost or electricity production, because you hear so many people saying, well, renewables are just extraordinarily cheap. And the reason we have expensive energy is just because the international gas price is high. Now, sure, the international gas price is high, but I think people are massively underestimating the overall cost of renewables because they're not taking account of some of those offsetting measures that you have to take, or the need to kind of increase the level of baseload capacity alongside them just to lurk in the background in case something goes wrong.
Well, part of the issue there, I think, is exactly how you defined it, which is we don't need to understand how affordability works. The government doesn't need to understand how affordability works. It needs to build a market where those kind of decisions can happen with the people who actually know what they're talking about. Investors in energy do understand affordability. And the issue for investors in renewable power is that the government has essentially swallowed the idea that all of the social costs of renewables are everybody else's problem, just not theirs. So if I want to build a wind farm, that's great. I can be paid a massive subsidy in order to generate the power when the wind is blowing. When it isn't blowing, they're going to give me even more money through a constraint payment. And the cost of connecting that grid is on somebody else. So connecting that farm to the grid is on somebody else. It doesn't matter if it's in the right place where everybody actually wants that, and so it goes on.
And that stuff, the project has been on display again this week with the government saying again that they are going to ensure that every new build has solar panels on it.
Yes.
Which seems like A, ridiculous timing for an announcement on that, given what has just happened in Spain and Portugal, but B, a surefire way of driving up house prices.
Well, I think the government has demonstrated they care more about what the former Prime Minister Tony Blair thinks and Unite the Union, both of whom have said disobliging things about net zero as a political project this week, than they do about facts on the ground, which is Spain. The reason for this announcement being brought forward is, I think, so that Keir Starmer can demonstrate that he and Ed Miliband are still on the same team. This debate on compulsory solar panels on roofs has been going on since 2019. It's a European debate. They brought in a policy last year that makes it compulsory on new build by 2029. And in the UK, back in October, it looked like the developers had won and that this would be encouraged but not compulsory. Cue 6 months of lobbying from the solar industry, and bizarrely, the CPRE, who are the colloquially known as the NIMBY lobby, and solar is now compulsory again on new homes. And this is just cult-like behaviour. I mean, the benefit to emissions of having solar panels on roofs is negligible. If you paper the countryside with roofs covered in solar panels, you're going to make a marginal difference to the UK's overall emissions profile. And most of those solar panels are going to be fairly useless because the ones that we have at the moment are the deliberate choice of homeowners where it makes some sense because the roofs are pointing in the right direction. South facing is best. They're sloped at a 30 to 40 degree angle. They are at a lower latitude, more in the south than the north, and they're not in London, which bizarrely is the worst place, which is because of tall buildings and shielding and shading and trees and everything else. And this is just a decision is best left to the householder. So if you wanted, for example, to grow the economy by encouraging everybody to get a car, you would mandate on buildings that everybody should have a garage, and it's the same level of stupidity. So what they should be doing is saying there are many good reasons to buy solar panels for your home, and they should be saying to the developers, we would love it if you encourage people to do this. And they're doing the same thing with heat pumps. And the developers can then turn around and say, yeah, I think this works for this development, but not for this one. And there is demand in this area, but not in this area. And then the market would actually working. This way, we're going to end up with an awful lot of rubbish. And it's going to repeat the error that was made during the Green Deal in the last decade, where the government said energy efficiency matters, like insulation on homes, cavity wall, spray foam, all that sort of stuff, which ended up with a bunch of people going into homes, installing the wrong stuff, and then a huge bill being presented to the homeowner later when it had to be ripped out. A lot of solar panels that aren't needed or aren't very useful are going to be in that boat.
And it seems to be another example of the government sort of saying one thing and then doing the opposite. So it says it wants to drive up home ownership and make homes more affordable, and then it's sort of increasing the costs on producing those homes and building those homes.
Oh, it also sounds a lot to me like central planning just doesn't work. And I'm shocked. Quick, the another example.
Well, the great illustration of that point was another announcement, I think just over a week ago, where the government is investing in R&D to dim the sun. So we are simultaneously paying for rooftop solar and less sunlight. It doesn't make sense.
I've never been sure we're unduly troubled by the sun in this country, nice as the weather is at the moment.
Which brings us nicely on to our next topic. There's a really interesting article in The Economist this week, Tom, that you pointed out, about how difficult it is to build homes in London. Now, that isn't new news. That won't be surprising to many IEA podcast listeners. But it had a slightly interesting angle in that, and one potentially the government could listen to, in that it's not all necessarily about green belt and new towns, but actually it's almost impossible to build on brownfield sites in London, which you'd typically want to build on, looking at them, that even have planning permission.
Yeah, and so that I think is the crucial point at the end. So it's an article in this week's Economist that is titled "Why Building Anything in London is So Hard," and they start with the suggestion that you could build 400,000 homes on brownfield land in London. So that's land that's already been developed, that probably no one's going to be too upset to see transformed into some lovely new housing.
Sort of deindustrialised land, isn't it?
In many cases, yes, and you see it in really quite expensive parts of London, very desirable parts of London, very well connected parts of London, often along old canals or railway lines or stuff. Lots of underutilised or unused kind of box land and deindustrialised land, as you say. Now, we have a housing problem. We desperately need vastly more homes in London, more development of all kinds. If we were able to get that, it would be a massive boost for our economic growth. And of course, the demand is there. You don't need the government planning this or subsidising it or anything else. If they get out of the way, I think the houses will be, or the homes, apartments, whatever, will be developed in response to market demand, and you can draw more people into a prosperous city, which is an engine of growth. Now, first quarter of 2025, which just finished, apparently there were only 1,200 home starts in London, which is about 5% of the target. As much as we believe in targets, the targets are probably inadequate, but we're not getting anywhere close to them. And so, look, you raised this point. A lot of brownfield sites have planning permission. And this is the quite extraordinary thing, I think, because often we think, well, the problem is that you just can't get planning permission. It takes too long, or it won't be granted, whatever. In this case, no. Half of the sites, the brownfield sites, have planning permission. Almost all of them, according to this piece in The Economist, have been rendered unviable by the requirements that the planners have imposed. And so to give you an example of a couple of those things, in many London boroughs, they will require up to 50% of the new homes developed to be affordable. And that means basically the developer has to sell them at below market rates. Now, you don't have to be a top-class economist to realise that if you're selling nearly half of your output below market rates, the other half is going to have to be above market rates to compensate. And the question is, can you actually sell enough of those flats at jacked up rates to compensate for the subsidised stuff that you're putting in place? In many cases, no. So the project becomes unviable. Another one is that often when you're building on disused land, it's been taken over or started to be taken over by nature. So you've got sort of, scrubby growth and lots of animals and insects and birds moving in and everything. And the problem is when you build a new development, according to the regulations, you have to ensure that biodiversity increases by 10% and that you maintain that increase in biodiversity for 30 years. Now, if you're dealing with a site which has been overrun by, foxes and birds and insects and scrubland and stuff, and you want to build a nice apartment block for people to live in, it's going to be quite hard to increase biodiversity by 10% and maintain it for 30 years. So again, you have to have these very expensive offsetting measures, and maybe you have to go and build a park somewhere or something. I don't know. And again, you render a development which has in some sense been permitted, which no one I think would be very sad to see occur, which would fill an important economic need, and that the market has demanded and that people want. And it's just unviable because of the requirements that government has imposed. And this is in a city that desperately needs new housing. I mean, this seems to me fairly close to the definition of insanity. We've got ourselves tied up in so much red tape that something that basically everybody agrees should happen and would be beneficial can't happen because of bureaucracy.
There's multiple layers of insanity in that. One of them is the biodiversity target in itself. Why are we putting higher value on biodiversity, having more different types of spider in an area than we are people having homes? I mean, if you ask anybody on the street, most people would say, actually, people having homes is probably maybe higher than having more spiders and more mice.
Not in Southwark or Lambeth.
But then the other thing, just to take it a little bit back to Econ 101 on the affordability point, to have certain quotas for having things below the market rate sort of ignores how the market rate is set through supply and demand. The more houses you build, the cheaper the houses will be overall.
Yeah, I think the idea, they call it filtration, if I'm not mistaken, right? That if you could build lots of super luxury apartments or houses in London and people will say, well, what's the point of that? You're only building stuff for rich people. Okay, but if all of the rich people trade up into these new and more desirable properties, then the people the rung below them move into their old houses, and so on. And it filters down through the system so that even building very expensive luxury properties can have an impact on affordability for ordinary homeowners or would-be home buyers. And this, again, this is just economics. This is the way things work. But it's not the way the planner's mindset works.
So do you think the government needs to be thinking more about this problem and less maybe, or maybe probably in addition to their focus on new towns and green belt regulation and that sort of thing?
I mean, why not everything?
Yeah.
Right? As long as it's market-led, then I'm in favour of all of these different options. I think one of the interesting things this reveals, though, is that colloquially people will say, England is full. There's no space to build anything. Now, that's not true. We know that's not true. But then people, I think, could be forgiven for looking at London, a very built-up, dense city for the most part, and saying, well, London at least is full. It's going to be expensive. What can you do? And then you discover, well, actually, no, there's lots of disused land you could build housing on. You could build 400,000 new homes, but we're preventing that from happening. Actually, there are lots of other ways that that's true as well. I mean, a lot of central London areas that would be the most desirable, the most expensive, lots of it is taken up with social housing, which is built in the post-war era, often at quite low densities. And repeatedly, when the residents of those social housing estates have been given the opportunity to vote for redevelopment, which is normally a kind of phased demolition and then rebuilding, nicer properties, denser properties, they can move back in afterwards, but then there's lots more space for more people. Again, you can build a lot of homes in London which appears to be full to the uninformed eye. There's this stuff called strategic industrial land. The famous one, I think, would be Park Royal in West London, which is a massive waste of space. I mean, it's full of useful warehouses and distribution centres and stuff, but does that need to be in possibly the best connected part of London for public transport? I don't think so. And you can go on with this. I think the danger with all kinds of policy reform, actually, but it's particularly true of housing, is that you fixate on one particular silver bullet, and it might be Greenbelt, or it might be new towns. Actually, this is such a big and deep-rooted and long-running problem. I mean, it goes back decades, many decades. You've got to kind of do everything. And, maybe only the silver bullet stuff attracts headlines, and maybe lots of other thinking about all of these other areas is going on under the bonnet. Frankly, I'm not so sure. But that is really what needs to happen. It has to be a really concerted effort across the board to allow more development as long as it's market-led.
You're absolutely right. But one interesting point about the brownfield specifically is that before this government, the previous government had always shied away from the general political consensus had been to shy away from building on greenbelt or making any changes to our green and pleasant land. So it had always been brownfield first. So that was the government line. That was what they were trying to push. That we're not going to build on your lovely countryside. We're actually just going to build on these horrible disused plots. They haven't done that, at least nowhere near enough. And now we're suddenly talking about, well, don't forget this. You're right. It sort of pivoted from the government as a state entity rather than a political party. It's pivoted from one to the other.
Yeah,
it's like actually you can and should need to do both.
Yeah, I mean, look, to be clear, we should build on greenfield.
Yeah.
And this idea that an intensively farmed field just outside London is better off or more natural than a nice suburb, that's just silly. It's not true. And so we should build on greenfield land. And the old thing that there's plenty of disused land we can build on instead, that was always wrong. And it was politically motivated to say that you can fulfill the housing needs of the country just by building on already developed land. Now, having said which, you really have an open goal here, I think. In London, as I said, engine of economic dynamism in the UK, you could fit 400,000. I mean, I'm taking The Economist at its word on that. Maybe it could be a lot more. Who knows? Why not do it? And why not make it as easy as possible to do it? It feels very much like the government saying you can only build on brownfield land, but no, not like that.
Yes, exactly. Well, we'll send this podcast to Sadiq and Angela after this. Hopefully they'll.
I think they listen already.
Yes. No. Yeah. Sure. And then just to move on to our final topic, to bring it back to the sort of current affairs question, a few major sort of political moments this week. Donald Trump has hit his first 100 days in office in the first instance. I mean, we've spoken endlessly about tariffs and whatnot that Trump has been up to. I think Niall Ferguson has pointed out that, like him or loathe him, he's not half cracked through his to-do list in that 100 days. But there's an interesting question here that there's a good Substack on by Substack and No Opinion, where he basically lays out a bit of an apology to libertarians. He says, "Look, he doesn't consider himself a libertarian necessarily, but has maybe been overcritical, and that is laid bare by the changes that Trump has made on the economy in particular. Who are the people out there slamming their fist on the table for free trade? It's people like Rand Paul, who is a Republican but not a Trump touting Republican. Is there a sense that people are starting to wake up to a move away from the principles that we believe in? Our opinions can sometimes be criticised for being Econ 101 or it's a little bit more complicated than that, actually. But now we've moved so far away from Econ 101 that we are looking at a downturn in the global economy to quite a drastic scale, thanks to Trump's sort of economic nationalism. Is there hope, Andy, do you think, for people to suddenly start thinking, oh, hang on, maybe those guys at the IEA were right all along?
Oh, that will never happen. I guess the best we can hope for at the moment is an echo of Sarah Palin's challenge to Barack Obama's supporters back in the day, where she opined, how's that hopey, changey thing going for you? And I think that's very much the case with the Trump supporters now. They've been sold the fever dream of a toxic narcissist, someone who can never be wrong, someone who believes inviolably in their own superior judgment to even established economic nostrums like free trade. And reality is biting. Clearly, the tariff plan is not going well, and if he doesn't rein it in even further than he already has, the American economy is going to suffer. Those manufacturing jobs he's promised won't appear, and he'll be there blaming somebody else, at which point the shtick is going to get quite old and quite tired quite quickly. His peace plan, how's that going? Ukraine and Russia are still fighting, and the plan that he has introduced to try and make the Ukraine a effective colony or vassal state of America in return for thin security guarantees appalls most people. I mean, this isn't really a libertarian versus national populist point, but really, is that what people wanted? To see the humiliation of our allies, to destabilize security in Europe, to empower an authoritarian fool like Putin, who will never be sated. This cannot be the shining beacon on the hill that America dreams to be.
Do we think there's hope for people to wake up to that and then see the light?
I always try to be optimistic.
Nice.
Thank you. I think so. The thing that you would really want to see happen in response to this, and I kind of go back to this, the thing that I think libertarians have always been right on is they always say to progressives, look, you're very comfortable with giving government more power. What if someone who holds views completely antithetical to your own comes in and uses that power to their own ends or to advance their own ambitions? Wouldn't you then say, you know what, libertarians, you were right. Maybe the power of government should be limited very strictly. Maybe there should be things that government just isn't allowed to do. Maybe we shouldn't have this whole culture and ethos of the government intervening in the economy left, right and centre for political objectives, because if someone comes in with some really terrible ideas, they can make a horrendous mess. And, certainly on trade, I think that's what we're seeing. And I do find this sort of spectacle of the leader of the free world sort of changing his mind on seemingly a daily or at least weekly basis on what tariff rates will be and how they'll be structured. It's just chaos, but it's also, I think, a power that no politician ought to have. And I'm not necessarily saying that government has to be tied up in its own brand of red tape all the time. It's not so much about the process as it is about the limits on power and what you can and cannot do. And I always rather liked, I think when Ayn Rand talked about her philosophy applied to economics as being the complete divorce between economics and the state, in the same way that people want to, divorce the church and the state. And I know that that's an unachievable goal and may strike many people as wild and radical and bizarre. Nevertheless, as close as we can get to that as possible, I think we'd be in a much better place. And I think one of the disappointments over this first 100 days, of course, there are many, and Andy referred to some of them. I think that Elon Musk is going to be leaving the White House or leaving Washington, D.C. fairly soon. His Department of Government Efficiency doesn't seem to have got all that far. Now, supposedly he told cabinet colleagues that they'd laid the ground for like 160 billion of spending cuts. Now, that's far from nothing. But in the country with a, 1.5 trillion budget deficit, which Trump, through spending and through taxes, is going to make much worse over the coming years, it does feel a little bit like a drop in the ocean, and also something which won't be sustained for very long. My guess, and I'd love to be proved wrong on this, because people who listen in every week will know that we were quite excited about the possibility of Elon Musk applying that sort of corporate mindset of restructuring to the federal government, and what lessons maybe we could learn in other countries. So I'd love for it to work out and to become an example of how government can be downsized. But my guess is that political priorities are going to shift to the extent that they haven't already. And it will be sort of a forgotten thing that drifts away. And ultimately, the trajectory of government growth won't significantly have been changed.
This is tech bro amateur hour trying to change government by app. I mean, this is not serious. If you want to reduce the size of government, and this is a lesson that we learned the hard way in the UK through the very short-lived Truss administration, is you have to change legislation. You have to get things in the US through Congress. And if you really want to reduce the size of the state, you've got to tackle the really expensive items, welfare, pensions, Medicaid, and all the things that populists don't want to touch because they are the third rail of politics. So if Elon Musk leaves the White House, I don't really think that's such a bad thing. I think it really will depend on whether somebody else comes in who actually understands how to shrink the state. And that is a reasonable criticism of the right generally. They've got an awful lot of charismatic individuals who talk the talk, but very few people who know how to deal with the state in its own backyard.
Yeah. And I think that there is an element, though, that was quite interesting about DOGE, even if it wasn't going to address those big ticket items like entitlement spending and defense spending and everything in the US. I guess this is another piece I saw in the Economist this week. They have someone by invitation who was at the Heritage Foundation writing his take on Trump's first 100 days. As you can imagine, it's rather more positive than what we've just been saying. But, he was talking about the three branches of government in the US, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. And he was saying basically that the New Deal, Roosevelt in the 30s created a fourth branch of the American state, the administrative state, what we might call the regulatory state, or the blob, if you're being pejorative. And deep down, buried somewhere in the Trump Make America Great Again project, is this idea that fourth branch of government does no good, in fact, does a lot of harm and ought to be dismantled. And I don't think you have to believe that wholeheartedly to think that there is something there. We've seen across the world, people are more and more frustrated with the non-elected bits of government. A lot of what we talk about on this podcast, and indeed in the IEA's research work, is the baleful effects of regulation and discretionary bureaucratic power. And so I guess what I really hoped for from Elon Musk and that DOGE project was a serious, and stress serious, assault on that part of the state, and maybe an example of how other countries could go about similarly, if not abolishing, at least minimizing that bureaucracy.
I think that's right. I think both things are right. Both points are right. I've written this week in Conservative Home about DOGE versus Afuera, which is what Malay is doing in Argentina, lifting from the Cato Institute, where somebody pointed out that the difference between the two is that in Argentina, Malay's team have a mission to, rather than improve government efficiency in the way that Musk does, which is good, but the Malay's team's mission is to improve individual freedom, and that is not just about tackling inefficiencies or tackling the regulatory state. But that is, I mean, they're lopping off government departments.
And then ultimately, you just need government to do less.
Yes.
There are limits as to how much you can reduce spending unless government just stops doing some stuff.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately where we need to get to. Now, I do think if you got rid of a lot of the regulatory bureaucracy, almost by default, the government would be doing less, and that would be helpful, and you might get more growth as well.
You've got to get rid of the regulations as well.
You do, yeah.
I mean, a case in point, we talked amongst ourselves earlier this week about which UK agencies might disappear in a AFU-like situation. And you could, for example, imagine that the Information Commissioner's Office would not be needed in this bright, happy future, but you've got to get rid of GDPR first. Yeah. And if you want to have any sort of data protection regulation at all, it's got to be minimal. And we're nowhere near that.
Yeah, that's right. And without that, you're left cutting away days, civil servant away days and other things, which is really good. Like, we want to see less of that sort of thing, but...
Pay for your own tea bags, that kind of stuff, right? Yeah. I mean, to hark back to that conversation, actually, and not to go on too much of a diversion, but I think the number one quango or whatever that was in my line of sight there was Offcom, which I think it's quite funny to reflect that Offcom was introduced post-privatisation to try and create a more competitive telecoms market. I think it was thought, someone told me this, that it would never need more than 50 employees, that in fact it would wither away over time as the market became more competitive. It was no longer needed, and at some point it should be sunset altogether. Now, I don't think many people could argue that we don't have a competitive telecommunications market in the UK now. There is still an issue with BT and Openreach, I think, which might need a little bit of competition regulation applied to it. But for the most part, you have a very dynamic private sector economy, lots of competition, and consumers are almost always much better protected by businesses competing with one another for their custom than they are by government regulating from the top down. But what you've seen with Ofcom is this kind of perpetual reach, like they want to take on more stuff, more responsibilities, and so now they're sort of styling themselves as the internet regulator. And as Andy says, you could get rid of Ofcom. I'd rather like to get rid of Ofcom, but if you don't get rid of the legislation and the regulation underneath it, okay, maybe stuff just wouldn't be enforced, but are you really in a better position? No, you do need to fundamentally change the scope of government and the things it's trying to do and the regulations, the degree of control it is trying to impose on the market.
Potential ray of hope on that, though, is, as pointed out by our old colleague Eamon Ives this week, the football regulator, which is being built, again, contrary to what the government is saying about cutting the quangos, they are legislating to institute a new football regulator, but they are building into that legislation effectively a sunset clause. They're giving future Secretary of State a point at which they can review and recommend to abolish the regulator. So more of that.
I mean, certainly more of that. And in a way, I'd like it to go even further. I'd like to reverse the burden of proof in a way. And make it so that these things just automatically shut down unless they are actively renewed. And I think we could do that retrospectively as well. Perhaps you'd want to do it on a sort of staggered timeline and just line everybody up, and we'll assess one thing a year or maybe more than one thing a year and decide, are these actually valuable? Now, of course, the problem is you run into public choice theory, and these are not just institutions of government, but they are interest groups, and they support often a whole industry of lobbying and everything else. So in a sense, that's better than nothing, what Eamon has written about there, but it's also slightly naive on the government's part to think. And it seems pretty clear to me, right, that they've come in and they've been lumbered with this stupid Tory idea, which they wouldn't have come up with themselves, probably. I mean, they might have done, but I don't think it would have been a priority this early in government for them. But they're thinking, well, we have to go through with it now. It's already in train, but maybe we can just make it easier to get rid of it in a few years. Well, was it Reagan? Who was it? Or was it Milton Friedman? Nothing so permanent as a temporary government institution. And there's a lot of truth in that. If they don't like the idea, and I don't think they do, scrap it now.
Yeah. It was Friedman, that may have been Friedman or Reagan, but Friedman definitely said government projects that fail get given more resource.
Right.
So you can see if in a few years when the Secretary of State's deciding whether to abolish it because it's not gone too well, we'll actually say, well, what we need to do is double down and it more.
Let's talk about successful, dynamic, competitive industries. Is there anything we do better in England than football? Basically, no. The case for regulation here is non-existent.
Yeah. quite. And then just before we wrap up, yesterday was local elections day here in the UK, and today the results are starting to trickle through. The first one of significance is that Reform have won their by-election against the Labour Party, well, against everybody, but it was the Labour Party's previously held seat by 6 votes. This is our own version, I think, of the question about the move to collectivism or the move away from the principles that we might argue for, especially in economics. Reform so far have displayed themselves to be a rather collectivist party, especially with their pledge to nationalise steel and other things. To me, this looks like a further reflex from the incumbents. So last year, we saw the Labour Party win a stonking majority, largely fueled by not being the Tory party. People were fed up, things aren't going very well, the economy's not growing, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to kick them out because they're rubbish, and we're going to try the other guys. Almost a year down the line, short of a year down the line, people are pretty fed up with the Labour Party because they haven't fixed any of these things yet.
Yeah.
Or at least they don't feel like they are fixing any of these things, and they look like, although this is local elections, so loads of caveats, but it looks like a little bit of a pivot away. Let's try something new. Let's try Farage and a bit of collectivism. So on one hand, perhaps a bit of positivity to take from that, because people are seeing that the system's broken and wanting to do something about it. But going in potentially the wrong direction, depending on what Reform's final policy platform looks like. The next general election could go either way. But
I mean, to be fair, I don't think we're even close to talking about a final policy platform for Reform at that moment. I'm not sure there's much of a policy platform there at all. And I mean, yes, there have been hints of an economically nationalist direction, with, say, advocating steel nationalisation. It does, unfortunately, I think this is regrettable, but it appears to make sense for Reform to become a more collectivist but conservative or authoritarian party, given where the votes they're going for are, and the nature of those voters and so on. It also still seems to me to be at odds with the personalities and the kind of historic ideologies of many of the people involved in Reform. I mean, Nigel Farage himself is more or less a Thatcherite on economics. I mean, it's not a pure thing, obviously, but I think he definitely is on the free market end of the spectrum if you look at British politicians as a whole. Other figures, I think, are similar in Reform, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. But for me, I don't detect in the high kind of vote share or polling share for Reform at the moment a particularly pronounced desire for a really souped up kind of populist nationalism, collectivism or anything. No doubt those tendencies are there, but they've always been there. And I know our colleague Steve Davies talks a lot about the realignment and focusing more on cultural issues and questions of national identity than on economics. I can see that going on as well. I guess my point is that it's too early to make a definitive statement as a direction that Reform is going to take. And just before we started recording this podcast, we played the 1 minute manifesto from the lady who has won in Runcorn, the by-election last night. And if you listen to what she said, she could have been standing for the Conservatives. She could have been standing for Labour. It was sort of maybe less so for Labour, but it was like law and order and deal with litter and antisocial behaviour, and we don't like the incinerator down the road. So pretty bread and butter local stuff. I don't see in that a big shift in an unfortunate direction. What I think is going to be really interesting, though, you look at the direction of the opinion polls, the results in by-election, local government elections. In a year, we're going to have Welsh Assembly elections. And I think there's a very strong chance that Reform could end up governing Wales, or at least leading the Welsh Assembly. Now, at that point, you can't simply be a protest party anymore. You have to have a platform of policies because you have to govern, however limited, that government might be in what they can achieve. Now, then I think we'll have a bit of proof in the pudding and we'll see what direction Reform is going to go. And that will have implications for the next election here. My hope, obviously, and I don't really care what political party wins, I just want to see free market individualist policies pursued. But I do think the direction that Reform ends up going will have an impact on the rest of the political spectrum in the UK, because they will determine to some extent where the Conservatives end up on questions of economics, and that will have an impact on where Labour feels free to go as well. So in a sense, the reason it's worth talking about these party political dynamics on the IEA podcast, although we're not a partisan organisation and we basically just want good policies, is that where the Overton window sits does depend on this push and pull between different parties and different factions within parties.
It does, but potentially one of the hopes for us is that the government doubles down on the good stuff it's doing on, for example, on planning and on stripping back the state, and sees the wins in that they've already found sort of green shoots of, especially with the planning reform, makes that their case, and then the free market case is made, and hopefully the results will start to show by the next election, and that's our free market.
Well, do reform become an outwardly NIMBY party? If the government goes hell for leather on development, or even just tries to push through some unpopular developments around the country, I suppose the incentive for reform, politics being a grubby business, is to become an obstructionist, a NIMBY party, and try and court votes that way. I mean, that would be extremely disappointing. We'll see the extent to which they can stick to principle, because lots of people in reform have talked about the need to build more houses.
I mean, they are already a NIMBY party on energy.
Yeah.
I mean, effectively, they've gone too far in the other direction to Labour by being abjectly opposed to renewable power to the extent that they will try and bury all electricity cables rather than have pylons, because people might object to the visual obstruction, which would, of course, render most projects unaffordable, and I think it would only make the case for nuclear power as being the new form of decarbonised energy on the grid. So that, I think that's happening. I mean, the incentives for to win local council elections through NIMBYism have been endemic for decades.
Yeah.
It's how the Liberal Democrats have periodically risen and managed to secure thousands of councillors. But in respect of reform's longer-term future, they will face the same challenge any third party does, which is to get to where they've got to. They've got to bring on board people who they have not necessarily vetted well, who don't necessarily have coherent views, and will then find themselves having real opportunities to exercise power and do so incoherently, which will lead to further problems of splits.
Well, whichever directions the parties take, they will always have us waving the free market flag over here in Westminster. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for. Indeed, we're well over time. So you get a bumper edition of the IEA podcast this week. Do follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk to keep up to date with everything else we're doing. And until next time, thank you very much.